September 7, 1940, London, England. The city trembled beneath a rain of fire. Sirens wailed across the rooftops as waves of Heinkel bombers cut through the smoke-filled sky. Down below, flames devoured entire streets, painting the night in orange and ash. The smell of burning brick and fuel hung heavy in the air. From his window on Trinity Street, Dr. Reginald Huxley watched the heavens burn. He could see the faint white streaks of searchlights slicing through the darkness, the tracer rounds clawing upward, and the bombers above, impossibly precise, even in cloud and shadow. He whispered to himself, almost in disbelief. How are they finding us? For weeks, the Luftwaffe had struck as if guided by an unseen hand. Every target, docks, factories, power plants, hit with chilling accuracy. Even when the moon hid and the fog thickened, the German bombers found their mark. The Royal Air Force was baffled. Intelligence believed spies were signaling targets. Others blamed chance. But Huxley, the eccentric physicist who spoke to his equipment like old friends, knew chance had nothing to do with it. In the dim basement of Cambridge University, surrounded by humming transmitters and oscilloscopes, he leaned over a set of headphones. Through the static came faint pulses, rhythmic, almost musical. He adjusted the dial, narrowing the frequency until the hum sharpened into a tone. He recognized the pattern. Two beams of radio waves crossing like invisible corridors in the sky. When a pilot flew between them, the tones merged, guiding him perfectly to his destination. Knickerbein. The Germans called it the crooked leg. It was navigation by radio beam, invisible to the naked eye but deadly in precision. Huxley scribbled notes on the back of a dinner napkin, ink smudged by his shaking hand. "They're not navigating by stars," he muttered. "They're following sound." The realization chilled him. The enemy didn't need clear skies. They needed only their beams. For 3 nights, he barely slept. Between air raids, he worked, tracing the frequencies, mapping the German transmitters, and testing theories on salvaged equipment. His colleagues called him unorthodox, brilliant but unstable. Yet in the chaos above London, his mind raced toward one thought. If the Luftwaffe could follow a beam, could the beam be bent? It sounded absurd, to twist the enemy's own signal against them. But what if Britain could send false signals, tricking the bombers into thinking they were on course when they weren't? It was a notion that bordered on madness. And Huxley was just mad enough to try. Before we dive deeper into this unbelievable wartime story, take a second to hit that subscribe button and join the WW2 Frontline Legends family. Tell us where you're watching from around the world. I love seeing our global community in the comments. Now, let's get back to the night the Luftwaffe thought they could never be fooled. The first test began quietly. No newspapers. No officers in pressed uniforms. Just a handful of men in a freezing bunker near the coast of Hull. The equipment was crude. 2 mismatched transmitters scavenged from civilian radio towers, a cluster of copper wire, and a map pinned to the wall. Major Colin Ward of the RAF Signals Branch stood beside Huxley, skeptical but willing. "If this doesn't work," Ward said, "we'll be broadcasting lullabies to the North Sea." Huxley smiled faintly. "Then let's hope the enemy likes our music." At precisely 2,200 hours, they activated the modified transmitter. The hum filled the bunker like a low heartbeat. Huxley tuned it to the captured frequency of the German Knickerbein system. His idea was simple. Overlay a false beam, one just strong enough to pull the enemy's path slightly off course. They waited. An hour passed. Then another. No change. The German formation stayed true. No interference, no confusion, nothing. The Air Ministry representative sighed. "That's it. Experiment's over. We've wasted enough time." But Huxley wouldn't quit. He spent the following nights buried in calculations, working by candlelight as the city above him shook from another raid. He retuned the signal, adjusted the phase, and realigned the antenna to the curvature of the Earth. What he proposed next was bolder. A triangulated broadcast from 3 hidden points along the coast, mimicking the enemy's own network. The second test took place on a foggy evening, October 1940. The Luftwaffe was targeting Birmingham's industrial district. At the same time, Huxley's team transmitted a false guidance path 20 miles east, over empty farmland. The German formation approached, confident, following their perfect radio beams straight into the trap. When the bombs fell, there was no explosion in Birmingham. Instead, fields near Market Rossen erupted in fire. Craters littered the soil where wheat had grown just days before. No one was hurt. The villagers woke to shattered windows and smoking pastures, confused but alive. In the bunker, the men cheered. For the first time in months, the sky over Britain held a small victory. Huxley stared at the flickering radio light, realizing the magnitude of what he had done. "We made them blind," he whispered. Operation Domino was born. Over the next weeks, the project expanded in secrecy. The government classified it under special electronic warfare. To the public, it didn't exist. Huxley's team, small but devoted, built new transmitters disguised as civilian radio towers. Each night, they broadcast ghost signals, weaving decoys into the Luftwaffe's navigation network. Entire squadrons were led astray. Some bombers dropped payloads over the North Sea, others over open countryside. Confused pilots returned to base with maps that made no sense. Intelligence reports noted German navigational anomalies. Huxley read the files with quiet satisfaction. But victory came with a price. His assistant, Arthur Bell, began to change. Once eager and loyal, Bell grew distant. He stayed late after hours, scribbling notes Huxley never saw. When asked, he brushed it off. Just refining signal stability. Yet something in his tone felt off, a crack of tension beneath his calm. One night, Huxley caught him near the classified transmitter schematics, copying coordinates onto a slip of paper. Bell froze, startled. "You shouldn't be here," Huxley said. "Neither should you," Bell muttered before vanishing into the night. Days later, the project experienced its first blackout. One of the ghost signals went dark mid-transmission. German bombers regained their path and struck Coventry with devastating precision. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. Someone had warned them. Huxley felt it in his gut. Arthur Bell was gone. When the Air Ministry questioned him, Huxley insisted they had a leak. He knew the beam alignments, he said. If the enemy gets that data, they can reverse the interference, or worse, trace it back to us. An investigation began. MI5 agents raided Bell's flat in Cambridge, but found nothing but scattered papers and a single envelope half-burned in the fireplace. Inside, Huxley found fragments of a coded message, written in German cipher. The last line still visible read, "They will soon know what you did." That night, Huxley stood alone in his lab, surrounded by the soft crackle of the radio. He listened to the static, thinking of Bell, of the innocent farmers, of the bombs that still fell. Every hum, every frequency now felt haunted. He turned back to his equipment. "No one will find us," he murmured. "Not this time." In the weeks that followed, the RAF reported unprecedented confusion among the Luftwaffe. Pilots dropped flares in the wrong towns, their navigation beams bending unpredictably. Huxley's method had grown sophisticated. He called it ghost beaming, layering false echoes into the German network so their instruments saw targets that didn't exist. Somewhere over the English Channel, a Heinkel navigator cursed his instruments. The crosshairs pointed at water, yet the dials told him he was above London. He released the bombs. They vanished into the sea. The British command quietly acknowledged Huxley's success, though few knew his name. In hushed meetings, officials debated expanding the operation nationwide. But Huxley worried about something else, the deeper cost of deception. The more beams he bent, the less he could tell where truth ended and illusion began. His sister wrote him a letter from Oxford. "You sound tired, Reginald. Are you sure you're saving lives?" He folded the letter and left it unanswered. His nights were now filled with whispers from the static, patterns that seemed to speak his name. Then came the fog. Late one evening, while recalibrating the secondary transmitter, a harmonic frequency spiked unexpectedly. It was brief, half a second, but it overrode one of the main German guidance beams. Huxley didn't notice until the alerts came in. A formation of bombers, misdirected by a false signal, had turned directly toward London. The alarms screamed across the city. Anti-aircraft fire erupted. Within minutes, the bombs fell, not on factories, not on railways, but across Huxley's own neighborhood. His lab windows shattered under the blast. He fell to the floor, glass cutting into his palms. Outside, smoke rose from the street he called home. When the sirens faded, he stumbled into the open air. The stars were gone, hidden behind fire and ash. He stood there, trembling, as realization sank in. His invention had done this. The device built to save lives had brought destruction to his own doorstep. He looked toward the horizon, where the false beams still flickered unseen. Somewhere, far above, the Luftwaffe pilots were flying blind, just as he intended. But down below, London burned. And in that silence, something inside him broke. November 1940, Cambridge, England. The fog over the city hung like a shroud, thick and unmoving. Inside the once bustling basement of the Signal Interception Lab, silence had replaced the steady hum of transmitters. Dust gathered on the tables. The smell of burned circuitry still lingered from the night. Everything went wrong. Dr. Reginald Huxley sat alone at his desk, his eyes hollow, his hands trembling slightly as he rewound a spool of magnetic wire. He hadn't spoken to anyone in days. The bombing had destroyed 3 blocks of his neighborhood, including the home of a family he knew, the Millers, whose little girl used to bring him apples from their garden. They were gone now. The same false signal that saved hundreds had claimed them. To the Air Ministry, it was an accident. To Huxley, it was a reckoning. He poured himself another cup of bitter tea gone cold and stared at a classified report stamped eyes only. The heading read, Investigation into Subject Bell, Arthur, Status, Missing. Below it, 3 words underlined in red. Potential enemy contact. The authorities were convinced Bell had defected or been compromised. Huxley wasn't sure. Bell had been brilliant, impulsive, and loyal, or at least he thought so. Yet the coded message found in his flat was undeniable. Someone had been feeding German intelligence. And whether by threat, greed, or conviction, Bell had become part of the very system they were trying to destroy. Still, something didn't add up. The cipher fragments in the burned envelope weren't purely German. They contained patterns that resembled British signaling structure, a mixture of both sides' encryption. Only someone inside the ministry could have written that. That thought haunted Huxley more than the bombings themselves. He returned to his desk and traced the curves of the radio frequency charts pinned to the wall. Each line represented deception, false paths that lured pilots away from cities and into empty countryside. Now those lines looked less like salvation and more like threads of guilt woven across the map of Britain. Major Ward entered quietly, his uniform dusty and his eyes tired. "Reginald," he said softly, "Command wants you to shut it down. They're calling it too unpredictable." Huxley didn't look up. "Unpredictable," he muttered, "is the only reason we're still standing." Ward sighed. "They're moving to a new system, radar countermeasures. They say it's safer." Huxley laughed under his breath, a sound both weary and bitter. "Safer," he said. "Nothing in this war is safe." 2 nights later, he broke into Bell's old quarters at the edge of campus. The door was unlocked, the room empty. Dust coated the shelves. Papers covered the floor, signal logs, transmitter schematics, and foreign correspondence. Beneath a pile of documents, he found something that made his blood run cold. A German technical manual marked with the eagle insignia, annotated in Bell's handwriting. But on the final page, scrawled hastily in pencil, were 3 words. "It's not them. Not them. Who then?" He felt a chill creep up his spine. The possibility that Bell had been framed began to take shape. That the real traitor was still inside the ministry, perhaps closer than anyone knew. But before he could piece it together, footsteps echoed in the hallway. 2 plainclothes officers entered. "Dr. Huxley," one said firmly, "you're coming with us." He was questioned for hours in a cold room beneath Whitehall. The tone was polite but sharp, the questions precise. "Did you authorize transmissions on unapproved frequencies? Did you make unsanctioned modifications to government equipment? Did you communicate with any foreign agents?" Each question felt like a blade, slicing into his sense of purpose. When it was over, he was told to rest, and not to speak of his work again. He returned to Cambridge in silence, only to find the lab sealed under military order. The transmitters were dismantled, the notes confiscated. His life's work vanished overnight, replaced by the cold indifference of bureaucracy. But Huxley wasn't done. That night, he reopened a hidden compartment behind one of the lab's panels, a cache only he and Bell knew about. Inside lay the backup transmitter, small but powerful enough to reach across the channel. He stared at it for a long moment, then powered it on. The soft hum filled the room again, that familiar pulse that once felt like victory. Now it sounded like ghosts whispering in code. He tuned into the German frequencies. They were still active, still guiding their pilots, still certain that their beams were true. He began broadcasting a new signal, subtle and steady, feeding faint distortions into their network. Not enough to cause crashes. Not enough to kill. Just enough to confuse, to delay, to mislead. It was his last act of defiance, a one-man war fought through static and silence. By winter, reports from the RAF confirmed something strange. Luftwaffe navigation had grown erratic again. Entire bomber groups were missing targets by dozens of miles. German intelligence suspected British jamming, but they couldn't trace the source. Somewhere deep in the countryside, Huxley smiled faintly as he tuned the dial. He had become a ghost inside the enemy system. Yet the weight of what he'd done pressed heavier each day. He'd outsmarted the Luftwaffe, yes, but at what cost? Every false beam he created carried the potential for catastrophe. And in war, accidents didn't forgive. He began keeping a journal, fragments of thoughts, formulas, reflections. One entry read, "Deception is a weapon without mercy. It doesn't distinguish between friend and foe." Another, written a week later, ended abruptly mid-sentence. On the night of December 12, 1940, the Air Ministry received an encrypted distress signal from the outskirts of Cambridge. It lasted only 4 seconds before cutting off. The frequency was identical to the one Huxley used in his private broadcasts. When investigators arrived, they found his lab deserted. The radio was still humming, its needle frozen on a single tone. Huxley was gone. No one ever saw him again. Rumors spread among those who'd worked with him. Some said he'd been taken by MI6 to work on secret radar research. Others whispered he'd been silenced to protect classified programs. The official record listed him as missing, presumed dead. But a few months later, a signal was detected, faint, almost inaudible, transmitting on an unregistered frequency near the same coordinates where he'd vanished. It carried no words, only a repeating tone that oscillated every few seconds, as if echoing the pattern of the Nicobine beams. To the trained ear, it sounded like a signature, a man's final fingerprint in the airwaves. Spring, 1945, Berlin falls. The war in Europe ends. The archives open. Among the captured German files is a report from the Luftwaffe's technical division dated late 1941. It mentions persistent interference from unknown English sources that caused navigational chaos during the Blitz. One paragraph reads, "We believe the British have discovered how to bend our guidance beams. Their deception mirrors our own. The sky itself cannot be trusted." Historians later find another note, handwritten in the margin. The name Huxley appears in intercepted British cables. The file ends there. Years later, in the early days of the Cold War, fragments of Huxley's theories reappear in classified electronic warfare manuals. His concepts of beam distortion and phantom frequency layering become foundational to radar jamming and early stealth technology. Engineers who studied those notes would never know the name of the man who wrote them, only that they came from an experimental physicist, 1940. Some say that Huxley, if he survived, lived quietly in the countryside under another name. Others believe he joined a covert branch of Britain's Electronic Intelligence Division, what would eventually become GCHQ. But there are stranger accounts still. A retired RAF operator once claimed that, during a training exercise in 1952, he picked up a transmission from an abandoned frequency, a repeating pattern identical to the old Nicobine jamming signal. "It was like hearing a ghost," he said. "No one else could detect it. Just me. The same tone, the same rhythm." It lasted exactly 4 minutes and 27 seconds, then vanished. When asked what he thought it was, the operator smiled faintly. "Maybe it was Huxley," he said. "Maybe he never stopped fighting." History remembers the generals, the air marshals, the names carved into medals. But behind the glory, there were others, quiet, uncelebrated, and unseen. The men who fought with tools instead of rifles, who battled the enemy not through gunfire, but through mathematics, logic, and invisible waves of energy that danced through the night. Dr. Reginald Huxley was one of them, a scientist who dared to make the Luftwaffe blind, who tricked the enemy with their own weapon, and who paid for his brilliance with silence. Somewhere, in the endless static between stations, perhaps his signal still lingers. A faint hum in the noise, a whisper from the past reminding us that even in the darkest nights of war, a single mind can change everything. And if stories like this one remind you that courage doesn't always wear a uniform, that sometimes the greatest heroes work in shadows, armed with nothing but imagination and will, then please share this video with someone who loves real history. Give this story a like if it moved you, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss another forgotten tale here on WW2 Frontline Legends. Because somewhere out there, in the hum of static and the glow of memory, the next legend is waiting to be heard. March 1946, London, England. The war was over, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the bombs that once fell. Britain stood scarred but alive. Streets once lit by fire were now shadowed by absence. Homes reduced to outlines, memories buried beneath brick and soot. Inside the newly formed Ministry of Supply, clerks catalogued what was left: aircraft, blueprints, prototypes, and files that had survived the chaos. One box sat unclaimed in the corner of a sub-basement, its label scorched by smoke. The faint writing read, Huxley R. Classified material. Inside were fragments of radio logs, torn schematics, and a photograph of 3 men standing beside a transmitter: Huxley, Major Ward, and Arthur Bell. Bell's face was crossed out in red pencil. L. A junior officer leafed through the pages, frowning. "Who is this?" he asked. His supervisor shrugged. "Some scientist from Cambridge. Went missing during the Blitz. Fall says he interfered with German signals, made them bomb their own coordinates." The young man laughed softly. "That's impossible." The older one looked up from his desk. "That's what they said about radar." He closed the file and placed it back in the box. "Burn it," he said. But the order was never carried out. The box vanished days later. No one ever signed for its removal. Across the countryside, winter surrendered to spring. In a small cottage near the coast of Norfolk, a farmer claimed his wireless picked up strange noises at night. Faint rhythmic tones unlike any BBC broadcast. "It's like someone tapping out Morse," he told the local constable. "Every night at the same hour." Then silence. Engineers dismissed it as atmospheric interference, the ghosts of old wartime transmissions bouncing off the ionosphere. But those who listened closely swore they could hear something beneath the static, a pattern too deliberate to be random. It was the same sequence that once guided the Luftwaffe's bombers. Only now, it led nowhere. Years passed. The war faded into memory. Streets rebuilt, children grew up, and Britain learned to live again. Yet in certain academic circles, whispers of Dr. Reginald Huxley persisted. Some claimed he'd been recruited into a secret government program focused on electronic deception, the early roots of what would later become electronic countermeasures. Others said he'd gone mad after the war, convinced his ghost signals had taken on a life of their own. One archivist recalled a curious report from 1948. Fishermen off the eastern coast had picked up a looping broadcast on an old shortwave receiver, a faint voice reciting numbers in German, followed by silence. The report was filed under unverified. But those who had known Huxley, the few who remained, couldn't dismiss the thought that he had found a way to stay connected to his creation. For him, the war had never ended. 1953, GCHQ headquarters, Cheltenham. A group of young analysts sifted through early Soviet radar intercepts. Among the clutter of signals was an odd anomaly, a repeating wave pattern almost identical to early British jamming techniques. None of the current engineers recognized it. The signature was old, from the 1940s, recorded on frequencies no longer in use. One of the analysts, a quiet woman named Evelyn Cross, traced the sequence through archived intelligence files. She found a match in a forgotten document labeled Project Domino, 1940. The author's name was blacked out, but the handwriting matched marginal notes in an earlier report on beam manipulation. Huxley, Reginald P. Evelyn hesitated. She'd read about him during her training, the eccentric physicist who supposedly fooled the Luftwaffe with false radio beams. Officially, the project never existed. But this pattern, this strange, perfect mimicry of his method, was too precise to be coincidence. She leaned back in her chair, listening as the signal played through the speakers. A steady oscillation, calm, haunting, almost melodic. It wasn't Soviet. It wasn't German. It was something else, something older. When she presented her findings, her superior told her to delete the file. "You're chasing ghosts," he said. But before she erased it, she wrote one note in the margin. "If this is a ghost, it's one that still knows how to speak." Some stories never end. They just fade into frequencies we can't quite hear anymore. In the decades that followed, Huxley's name was almost forgotten. Historians credited Britain's radar network, the bravery of the RAF, and the courage of the citizens who endured the Blitz. Few remembered the man in the bunker beneath Cambridge, the scientist who fought the Luftwaffe not with bombs, but with illusions. Yet echoes of his work remained everywhere. The technology that evolved from his ghost beaming laid the groundwork for Cold War radar jamming, stealth aircraft, and even modern GPS spoofing, the art of confusing machines with signals too clever to question. In a way, his invention lived on, a paradox that both protected and endangered the world that followed. Late autumn, 1960, Cambridge University. The old physics building had been renovated, the war's scars patched over with new stone. A group of students clearing out an unused storeroom found a metal container wedged behind a loose panel. Inside were notebooks, yellowed and brittle, filled with mathematical formulas and diagrams of intersecting radio waves. On the final page, written in faded ink, was a short note. Truth and deception travel the same path. Only intent separates them. RH. The papers were turned over to the university archives, but within weeks, they disappeared, signed out by Government Liaison, Scientific Division. No one could recall the name of the officer who collected Th.M. But among the students who handled the notebook, one swore she felt a faint vibration beneath the paper, as if something inside the ink itself still carried a pulse. Outside, in the quiet night, the city slept. The hum of distant radio towers mingled with the wind. Somewhere out over the channel, faint bursts of static still drifted through the air, remnants of transmissions long since forgotten. Some say those signals were just the echoes of wartime radio bouncing endlessly between the clouds and sea. Others believe they were something more, the last heartbeat of an idea that refused to die. Perhaps Dr. Huxley had become one with his invention, a presence woven into the static, forever tuning, forever transmitting, ensuring that even in peace, vigilance remained. Epilogue, the sound that never ends. If you walk through the old bunkers near the coast of Hull today, you can still see the rusted antenna mounts, the chipped concrete walls, and the faded marks on the panels where the equipment once stood. On quiet nights, when the wind passes through the hollow corridors, it hums soft, steady, rhythmic, like a pulse. The locals call it Huxley's song. They say if you listen long enough, the hum begins to change, rising and falling in tones that match the same sequence used to confuse the Luftwaffe's bombers all those years ago. Of course, the historians say it's just wind. Engineers blame it on metal resonance. But the old villagers, the ones who still remember the bombs, they'll tell you something else. He's still out there, they whisper. The man who fooled the sky. And maybe they're right. Because sometimes history doesn't end with a period. It ends with a sound. A sound that drifts through time, through frequencies, through the fabric of what we call silence. The static still hums. And if you ever find yourself tuning through an empty band late at night, and you hear a faint, steady tone that feels just a little too perfect, stop and listen. You might be hearing the ghost of Dr. Reginald Huxley. Anchor subscribe now for more powerful hidden stories from World War II and Cold War aviation. Speech balloon comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. Thumbs up like this video to help more history lovers discover it. Military Metal join the mission to keep these stories alive, because history's greatest revolutions often start with one person who refused to say, "That's just how it's D." 1.